Today I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Leah Broad. Leah is an award-winning writer, historian, and public speaker whose work focuses on 20th century cultural history and women in the arts. Leah's writing has appeared in The Guardian, BBC Music Magazine, Financial Times, The Observer. She has also been published in the Journal of the Royal Musical Association, Music and Letters, with chapters in books for Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and Routledge. Leah was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Oxford and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Her first book, titled Quartet: How Four Women Challenged the Musical World, is a group biography of four women composers: Ethel, Smyth, Rebecca Clarke, Dorothy Howell, and Doreen Carwithen. The book won the Royal Philharmonic Society Storytelling Prize in 2024, was shortlisted for the Slightly Foxed Best First Biography, and won the Presto Books of the Year award in 2023. Leah, congratulations on everything that you have been doing, and thank you so much for agreeing to this interview to discuss all things Rebecca Clarke and Ethel Smyth ahead of my album release of their sonatas for violin and piano.
Well, congratulations in turn on the album release.
Thank you very much. Despite having done 4 years of extensive research on Clarke and Smyth myself, I still have so many burning questions for you. Your book was instrumental in my own research on Smyth and Clarke. These incredibly important women who played such a vital role in shaping the history of classical music have since been written out of our history, and these are such important stories to tell. So I think I'd like to start off with discussion on Quartet itself. What was the inspiration behind the book? Why did you want to tell the stories of these four women, and why their stories in particular?
Yeah, so the reason I really wanted to write this book, I was thinking about a number of sort of different ideas, and at the time I was teaching quite a lot, and these were people who had chosen to come to university to study music, so they were quite well educated from a musical perspective, and when they came to my tutorials was often the first time they'd ever encountered music by women, and some of these were women who wanted to be composers themselves, and they were having these moments of epiphany at like 18, 19, 20 years old, going, wow, I never knew this music existed, I never knew that women did write music like this. And
I was one of those students, just not in your class.
But it was so frustrating to have got through a musical education for up to 20 years and to have never encountered music by women. That to me was quite extraordinary, and was also my experience that actually the first time I really encountered music by women, having trained as a pianist, was at university when I went into a lecture and there was stuff about women composers. So I wanted to write a book for a popular market that would introduce people to women composers, and so they would not be an anomaly, they wouldn't be anything weird. And also, it really frustrated me walking into bookshops, and you go into the biography sections, and all these biographies of, Virginia Woolf and all these fantastic writers. You walk into the music section, and it's sort of classical music was by and for men. And I'd be fine with that if it was true, but it's not. And so it felt like there was a real gap where this book ought to be, which is why of the books that I wanted to write, this one felt like the most important and pressing one to write at that time.
Amazing. And why these four composers? How did you pick?
So Ethel Smyth, I think you can't write the history of British music without good old Ethel. It's been done, I think that's wrong. And she really is instrumental to understanding the sort of experimental period of British music around the turn of the century, between the sort of transition from the 19th to 20th century. Ethel Smyth is so important in that. As an opera composer, she has to be in that story. So this book was never going to exist without Ethel Smyth. On top of the fact that she was a really important composer, what a fantastic personality, what a character. She's like a biographer's gift, right? So Ethel Smyth was going to always be the sort of the centre, the beating heart of the book. And then Rebecca Clarke and Dorothy Howell, in their lifetimes, were thought of being the three sort of main British women composers, Smyth, Clarke and Howell. So they pleasingly made a very fitting three. They wrote very different music, they had very different personalities, but they were writing at the same time. So that formed a natural three. And then for the fourth composer, because I did want to stretch further into the 20th century, I ended up choosing Carl Withen partly because I adored her music and I wanted every single composer in the book to be someone whose music I could unapologetically advocate for.
She composed a lot of film music, did she not?
And it was because she was a film composer, was actually because there were so many 20th century women who I could have picked, like Elizabeth McConkie, Elizabeth Lutyens, Grace Williams, but I ended up picking Carl Withen because she was a film composer. And that's something that's still seen as a bit unusual for women to do.
Yes.
And I wanted to show actually there was a precedent. There's this woman in the 1940s and 1950s who has an incredibly successful career as a film composer.
And she passed away fairly recently.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I got to speak to a lot of people who knew her for the book, which was a real privilege.
Wow.
And fascinating.
I'm sure. The historical erasure of these women, as a woman writing about women who have been erased from history, how did that impact your writing and how does that make you feel?
I love this question because this is something I thought about a lot, and also in terms of the way of framing the book, it's so frustrating to still have to use the term women composers. God help the person who refers to me as a woman historian. But like, it does also happen that when I've spoken at academic conferences and things, that there's still this tendency to say, oh yeah, you would say that, you're a woman. Okay. But I think, unfortunately, until gender is not an issue, we have to keep talking about it. And so that's why Quartet was not a sort of history of British music in which women were featured, which I would also love to write. But I ended up writing a group biography of 4 women because it felt like the issues that related to all of them. And so it made sense to actually go, okay, let's address the structural problems here that resonate across all 4 of their lives. But I do find it frustrating sometimes to be pigeonholed as because I'm a woman, therefore I probably do write about women. Yes, but I also wrote my PhD on Sibelius, for example, and actually I think these women also felt very frustrated to be pigeonholed by their gender. And that resonated very strongly with me writing about it later. So complicated, I think, is how I feel as a woman writing about women.
Of course. I'm curious, what impact do you think the book has had on your readers, and what's been the most meaningful experience for you since writing it?
I think definitely, for me, one of the most meaningful parts of writing this whole book has been seeing the impact it has on readers. And that it's been both really encouraging because I'm glad that this book has resonated with a lot of people, but it's also really disheartening the number of people who have come to me saying, you know, I wanted to be a composer when I was younger and I felt like it wasn't for me because I never saw myself represented, and so thank you for writing the book, but I feel like I wrote this book maybe 30, 40 years too late. And it's so frustrating to keep hearing that from an awful lot of women, is that they felt it was important because they had grown up in music and had never seen themselves represented in that way. Having said that, I think definitely some of the most meaningful things there was one woman who said to me actually, like, I'd almost given up on composition, but I'm now coming back to it after reading your book, and she's doing fantastically well now, and that's so wonderful. And also like younger readers as well who have said they're thinking about applying to university and now they've got the confidence to do it because they know that like there have been women before them who have been musicians in the way that they want to be. And I think
it's made such a difference for other people.
For at least a few people, at least it has made a difference. And I think it just shows how important it is that we change our education system and actually have women normalised within music education, because while it's wonderful that people have felt that this book has given them that representation, how sad that they have to find that representation in this book. It should just be normal. So yeah, it's a sort of a bittersweet thing.
So when writing the book, did you ever find yourself deconstructing your own misogyny in the process?
Yeah, and I think probably the point where this happened the most for me was the process of starting writing the book, because I started out as a pianist and I don't think it really ever occurred to me to question why I'd never learned any pieces by women. And indeed, I had been told that women sort of wrote bad music, and that women weren't given a good education in music, and so they weren't capable of really, they didn't have the education to write good music. And I don't think I ever really bothered pushing back against that narrative because I was too busy learning my Debussy. So I was like, okay, fine. And the first time I encountered Rebecca Clarke's music, I was listening to a podcast on my phone, and I wasn't really listening to what it was just on in the background, and this piece of music came on that made me stop in my tracks and go, what the blooming hell is this? This piece is incredible, what the hell? And when I looked down, it said Rebecca Clarke Viola Sonata.
So it was just on shuffle, and it happened to
be there, and it was Radio 3 Composer of the Week. That was it. And they'd started with the Clarke Viola Sonata, and I went, what the Hades? This goes against absolutely everything that I've been told about women's compositional capabilities. And so I started finding out more about Rebecca Clarke. I have to find everything I can about this woman, and the more I found, the more music I found that was just astonishingly good.
Yes.
And I think that was the point where I was like, wow, I've internalized a lot of narratives that it hadn't really occurred to me to question, but also a lot of the resources weren't available for me growing up to be able to really counter that. And so it wasn't then until this point where the time I happened to find Rebecca Clarke was when I was at university, and then had, luckily, books around me that I could then go and look up and go, okay, there's so much more out there.
Well, we never had the conversations. We were never taught this. And I remember my experience is very similar. It wasn't until I was 22, so I had just started my master's.
Yeah.
Where, funnily enough, it was also Clarke. Clarke was the first woman composer I had heard.
Yeah.
And it was just like a whole other world that opened up to you. And then you're suddenly, I'm not just a performer. I could look into it in other ways. But I recently had an experience where I was looking for a new violin. And I had never come across violins made by women, female luthiers. And I played an instrument, and it was fantastic, and I saw it was made by women. I thought, it can't be that good. And this is why I asked in your writing if you came across it, because I think it's so deeply internalized in ways that you don't even expect it. If coming from yourself, it was such a shock to me that I had that thought. But yeah, that's really interesting. I was wondering, given the historical erasure of these women, does writing a book like this feel radical or transgressive? Was there any pushback in the process, any fear writing it, if you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, a really interesting question that I've had to think a lot about since the book published, because I think when I pitched it, I didn't think it was hugely transgressive, because I guess at the time I was working as an academic. There's been a lot of feminist research for decades about these women, and so it felt like bringing that into a public space wouldn't be hugely controversial. And I guess so during the writing process, I was just excited and looking forward to kind of sharing these stories. I think I've been surprised by some of the tone of the reviews, actually, which have mostly been really positive. That's fantastic. But occasionally there were a couple of reviews that were sort of like, yeah, but where are the men? Why aren't you talking about men? Why are you talking about women? Where are the men in this book? And I'm going, sorry. And there was a review as well that said that, and I mean,
it's in the title.
well, quite. And they would. So there were a few frustrations, I think, that one would write a book about women composers without men being centred in the narrative, and the idea, I think, it was like, yes, but these women were only peripheral to what men were doing. Sort of, I felt rather missed the point. And you've read the book, so I felt that one of the points I was making was that there's a lot of structural sexism that stood in the way of these women progressing as much as they could have done had they been men. And there was a review that said, well, I read this whole book and there's no evidence for sexism here whatsoever. And I'm just like, what do you need to to recognise these structural problems. Like, I don't know how many more reviews I could quote that were obviously gendered, obviously sexist, and obviously impacted on these women's careers. I don't know what evidence would actually suffice to convince some people that actually sexism was in there. I would say it's been a mix. There's been a huge crowd of people who have really embraced the book, but I think there have been also some responses to the book that show why it's actually still needed to talk about gender within classical music, because there are some really entrenched ideas about the way women ought to be talked about. And if we are going to talk about women, fine, but not as sort of like genius, or not in the terms that we use for men, because the men are the good composers, and the women, well, we pay attention to them because it's political and we need to include women somewhere down the line. And I think that's nonsense. Like, when you listen to this music and you're not told who wrote it, I think it's brilliant music. And if we're going to use terms like masterwork and with terms like genius for men, we ought to be able to use them for women as well.
Absolutely.
And I don't think it's fair to say that if we're going to talk about women musicians, they need to be relegated to the sidelines. That's not how I want to talk about these women at all.
Do you see yourself as a feminism activist?
I think I do now.
When did that change?
I think it's the sort of thing where I wouldn't have previously said that, because it would feel like, I don't know, almost a little bit arrogant to be like, yes, I'm a feminist activist. But actually, I think now, particularly in a global context where I think there's a lot of things that I consider to be fundamental rights being sort of challenged and rolled back, I think anybody who does have a voice and a platform should use it. So I think of myself a little differently now compared to how I did when I started writing the book. Yeah.
Right. So let's talk about, now coming back to Smyth and Clarke, about the material that's available on them. So where is it located in terms of, I know that there's, of course, the collection of Smyth at the British Library, University of Michigan, strangely, letters in Florence. But as far as I'm aware, Smyth's diaries and letters is still unpublished, and Rebecca Clarke's memoir still remains unpublished.
Yeah. There's, this is just a problem of studying an awful lot of women, is that the primary source material is not currently published. Very often when women have died in their lifetimes, it's not thought important enough to collect all of their materials together in one archive or in one space. And so we very often find that their materials are spread out across the world, as is the case for Ethel Smyth. Bits have been lost, bits have been scattered somewhere down the line. Well, they're in the care of families, which was the case for Dorothy Howell, where not absolutely everything, but nearly everything of hers is held by her family, and thank God it is, because otherwise it would have all entirely been lost. But a lot of the research for this book has been sort of a case of musical detection, working out, where is this material? Who holds it? Who do I have to contact to get access to it?
A very long process, I'm sure.
A really long process, and not an uncomplicated process of just going to a library, checking out the score, and there you go, you have your materials. That's not the case for these women.
Did you encounter many dead ends?
Yeah, there are some things that I wish I had access to but will have been got rid of at some point. And so, for example, Carl Withen is unusual because her manuscripts are in an archive that's named after her husband. That's changing. But so her husband was a composer, and so all her manuscripts went with his. And so the reason why her manuscripts are preserved in such good condition, ironically, is because she was married to a man who was a composer whose work was thought important enough to preserve. So that's great that her manuscripts survived, but she obviously very carefully curated what did and didn't get put with his material. And so a lot of the stuff of hers that exists are the sort of the later stage manuscripts. And so we don't have the messiness, the working things out material that I had access to with Dorothy Howell, where there's been no process of curation whatsoever. It's what is in the chocolate boxes in the family home. But having said that, it made working through the material a really laborious process, because you never know whether the thing you pick up next is going to be like a new piece by her or a recipe that she wrote down on the back of an envelope. And so this would very often happen.
Either one is great.
Well, they both made their way into the book, actually, because it taught me a lot about who she was as a person. That she would keep these sort of like little bits of recipes, or she was very sort of sarcastic about people, modernist composers, and so she'd write like rude poems about modernism, basically, and they'd all be in there alongside her scores, and so that gave me a really interesting picture of who she was. Carl Witham ended up being a bit more enigmatic because she had pulled out a lot of the background to her life, if you like, and it was only the sort of the final scores that got kept. So yeah, it was a really interesting process trying to sort of piece together lives from really, really different materials.
Wow. What's really interesting about Clarke and Smyth, and of course there's myths, so correct me if I'm wrong, it's the great number of firsts that they both seem to represent. So Smyth was born in 1858, and at this time it was believed to be biologically impossible to be a great composer for a woman. She, of course, dispelled that notion, writing 6 operas, getting them all staged, becoming the first woman to be named a dame for composition, receiving 3 honorary doctorates in music, becoming a writer and militant suffragette. Clarke, on the other side, becoming one of the first 6 women to be accepted into Henry Wood's Queen's Hall Orchestra in 1913, creating an all-female string quartet, and her being the first woman to be accepted into Stanford's composition class in the Royal College. But is that true?
Yes and no. So there are a lot of important firsts, and I think it's really important that we acknowledge those. But I think sometimes the focus on firsts can erase previous things by accident sometimes. So actually Clarke wasn't the first woman in Stanford's composition class, but she has been billed as the first woman in Stanford's composition class. And yes, she was in the first 6 women who were in Henry Wood's orchestra, but again, there had been like all-female orchestras that were around at the time, and there were certainly other female string quartets before Rebecca Clarke's piano quartet.
Female orchestras in England?
Yeah, but so the difference is that gender-mixed orchestras were much more rare. And so in London, Henry Wood's orchestra was the first professional orchestra to hire women alongside the men. But I think it's important to like recognise the first, but also say, well, let's not erase everything that came previously by accident by focusing on these first. And it's tricky, and you know, this still happens, right? So Ethel Smyth's Wreckers has been having a bit of a resurgence recently, and the publicity materials, because we want first so much, will often say things like, this is the first professional adaptation in our lifetimes kind of thing, to really like make sure you can shoehorn that first in. And you're like, but it's been done at the proms, it's been done all these times, it's been recorded. Let's not make these women more exceptional than they are. And I think that was part of why I wanted to write a Greek biography as well, was to point out that actually one of the ways in which women were othered during their lifetimes was to make them feel more exceptional than they were. They were always talked about as the first or the only.
Yes.
And I really wanted to push back against that and say, yes, they achieved incredible things. Sometimes they were the first or the only, but sometimes they weren't, and both are just as important.
All 3 of the works that I recorded for this upcoming album were the first and only sonatas for violin and piano that Clarke and Smyth ever wrote. Smyth's A minor sonata was written in 1887 and premiered in Leipzig that same year, critics describing it as work devoid of feminine charm and therefore unworthy of a woman. Clarke wrote the single movement G major sonata and the 3-movement D major sonata in 1908. I believe these were the first complete works that she had done as a student at the Royal College of Music. What do you think of these early works in comparison to the composer's later creative output? And would you characterise their music as distinctly British?
I mean, so I really love all of these works, and I think they're quite different to their later works, but they have the kernel of what I think of as their kind of their key compositional style. And so the Smyth violin sonata is strident, it's full of like dense thematic material, it's really good fun to play. And so that, I think that's Smyth all over.
Have you attempted it on the piano?
Yes, not the violin. But yeah, you know, it has all these like, she doesn't particularly write necessarily very idiomatically for the piano. Sometimes she can be a bit unforgiving to her pianists and be like, this is the sound I want, make it work. Right. And you have to do it. That's fine. And I quite enjoy that about her style. It's just unapologetic. It opens just with her heart on her sleeve. And I think that is very true of her later works as well. And Rebecca Clarke is just a much more reserved personality all round. And so she has, I think, again, all the fingerprints of what becomes sort of key to her later style, completely present in these violin sonatas. She always foregrounds the performer. You can tell that this is a string performer writing these works. Yeah, and it's gorgeous writing. And also it has, you know, all the influences of sort of like the French influences that will become really important in her later style. As for distinctively British, I think their work is distinctively British insofar as British music was very experimental around this period, and particularly thinking about actually just taking influences from a huge variety of European styles as well. So Smyth is very influenced by Brahms in this sonata, and Smyth is experimenting with sort of like all different kinds of different sounds. So yes, in that respect, it's distinctively British. But I think that is probably the only ways in which it's distinctively British.
I think
I don't know, what do you think about it?
so much Vaughan Williams in it, in a way. It's sort of like overlooking from a distance at the English countryside. That kind of feeling. It's got moments of turbulence, of course, but it's quite visual. Her sonatas, these two sonatas specifically. It paints a very clear picture visually, I find, which, having played a lot of Vaughan Williams' music, is very good at doing that too. So I was curious whether, there's a bit of a connection there.
Well, she knew Vaughan Williams.
Yes.
And absolutely. He's so influential as a force in British music in this period that, like, undeniably, she is responding to his ideas, and certainly, like, later down the line as well, that's always an influence in her music. And later as well, when she's writing sort of British and Irish folk songs, there's that strain of sort of pastoralism and folk song, but she's always looking outwards as well. She's definitely a composer who, I think, combines and synthesizes a huge variety of influences to end up with this very almost theatrical style. As you say, it is very visual, it is very pictorial, and I really love that about her works. And maybe that's something that's actually true of all the women in Quartet, is that they have quite a strident visual style about them.
Well, the three outside of Smyth, I'm not sure if I would say this for her music, but Rebecca Clarke and the other two I find almost like film music.
Yeah,
as
very
if they
much so.
Were, yes.
And then Smyth's doing opera, which obviously has that very obvious visual theatricality. Yeah.
Did Smyth and Clarke ever meet?
A number of times, yes, actually. So I think the first time they met was when Smyth was conducting a band for a suffrage at home, and Rebecca Clarke was in the band, playing Smyth's music. And I think Clarke was very aware of her work, and she knew about her as a predecessor, and she read her books as well. And then they sort of knew each other as acquaintances and colleagues from that point on. And I think the point where they really met was Rebecca Clarke had a solo concert at the Wigmore Hall in the 1920s, which Ethel Smyth went to and was really impressed. And then she invited Rebecca Clarke round for Christmas tea at her house. And I think their responses to that just sum them up for me as personalities. So Ethel Smyth, after this tea, went and gushed to her great niece about the beautiful, stupendous Rebecca Clarke. She's wonderful, she's brilliant, she's beautiful, she's clever, she's got all this wonderful music. And Rebecca Clarke just puts in her diary, she went for tea with Ethel Smyth. She's a funny, cracked old thing, but quite nice, really. I mean, that really sums them up. There's a different generation. Clarke's a much more cool customer, I think, than Ethel Smyth, who's incredibly
Was there
honest.
any more writing in the diaries and the memoirs about the other composers, from Clarke about Smyth and vice versa?
Yeah, actually, so Clarke doesn't often in her diary, she only has like engagement diaries, she doesn't often comment about other women, but she will note down when she was reading books by Ethel Smyth and when she's sort of composers who she's seen their works performed, and sometimes Smyth will sort of crop in and out of there. And as for Ethel Smyth, actually in her unpublished diaries she does mention quite a lot of other women, and in letters as well, which again have not been published. Smyth does correspond with other women as well.
Interesting. I wanted to bring up other women's research on the composers. So musicologist Sophie Fuller has unveiled many women composers in England who have been lost to history or erased from history. Both Fuller and Smyth scholar Elizabeth Wood have argued that Smyth presented the notion that she was the only woman composer of her era, playing no small part in the suppression of other women's achievements. What are your views on this, and perhaps generally the roles of Smyth and Clarke as advocates for other women in the arts?
Yeah, so I think this is both true and not true. Smyth's a really complicated figure when it comes to her relationship with other women, because she was being forced into a position, working as a woman. She wanted to be taken seriously, and I think she internalized this problem that to be taken seriously she had to set herself apart from other women in some way. And I think she grappled with this a lot, because particularly when she becomes involved with the suffrage movement, I think this is a point where she starts to see herself slightly differently, and maybe thinks if she does accept how she's going to be seen, her gender is going to be part of the way people see her, whether she likes it or not. I think that changes the way she thinks about herself in relation to other women, and indeed other women musicians. But it's complicated because she wants to be taken seriously, and to do that there's this sort of battle in her between distancing and accepting other women. So in her published books, she doesn't often talk about other women composers, and is not vocally supportive. The things she says about Augusta Olmers are quite rude, actually.
Especially when commenting on her appearance.
Exactly, yes. And she sort of makes a passing reference to Dorothy Howell once or twice, just being like, oh yes, we ought to be paying attention to Dorothy Howell, but doesn't elaborate on it. But what I found researching for the book was a lot of unpublished material that really complicates it for me, because behind the scenes Ethel Smyth was really supportive of other women and would often write to them, would offer them support, and was very kind when she was reached out to by aspiring composers. So Dorothy Howell, for example, Ethel Smyth turned up to her performances, introduced herself afterwards, and was really a helping figure when Howell needed it most. And all that material is unpublished. And so there's no way until we start focusing on women that we'd know any of that. Avril Coleridge-Taylor as well, she wrote to her. Smyth wrote to Avril Coleridge-Taylor, and again was a support. And in her unpublished writing, Avril Coleridge-Taylor writes about Smyth as a real role model and figure of importance for her as a predecessor as both a conductor and a composer. But until we start focusing on women and looking for this material, we don't find it. And so if we don't know it's there, of course Smyth emerges as this really problematic figure who does down other women wherever she can. But actually, when we look at the unpublished record, it's much more complicated.
Throughout my research on Clarke in particular, the vast imbalances and contradictions on the sources available on them made piecing her life together rather difficult. The myths and misquotes are tricky to debunk. It's something we've already discussed a little bit. I'm curious what your experience has been with this and how you tackle this issue as a researcher.
Yeah, so I'm curious actually, before I answer this one, what are the myths that you feel were the most problematic, or that you really felt?
Well, it's the little details. It's the things like we discussed, the firsts, wanting Clarke and Smyth to be the first. So you'd say she's the first musician student of so-and-so, and then you go and fact check that. Or in my case, it was a little bit more embarrassing. I was presenting at the Ethel Smyth Symposium and said it and put it in my thesis, and then was corrected in front of all these people, which is
that's happened to all of us.
It's fine, but it's, you know, you'd rather have the material in advance because it makes you feel like I didn't do enough research. But because there's so much misinformation,
absolutely,
I wonder, how do you know what to trust and how much fact checking can you do before?
Oh God, this is a big question, isn't it? Oh yeah, before the book went out, oh my goodness, it was nerve-wracking just sitting there being like, oh, have I got all my facts right? I hope so. And yeah, I think so much of the problem, the way that these little myths or inaccuracies perpetuate is when the original primary source material isn't published. And so what I try to do with Rebecca Clarke, where there's been a bit written about her, but only so much of that is actually based on primary source material. And I wanted to make this book as much as possible based on the primary sources, and to go back, like, just not assume that anything that had been published about her was true, and go back to the beginning and start from scratch. And I was really lucky to be able to do that because Chris Johnson, who is Rebecca Clarke's great nephew by marriage, has just been unendingly helpful and has let me look at all her diaries and her sort of correspondence and all the material that he has relating to her. And
he's also very quick.
Yes, astonishingly so.
That same day.
It will be like, boom, okay. And that's been really useful. So then I can go back and, you know, there are a number of things that surprise me about Rebecca Clarke, because she's been written about as quite a shy and retiring person.
Yes.
That is not the person who's in my book. And I was really, I ended up liking her a lot more, I think, as the process of the book unfolded, where, you know, she's out drinking the night away for New Year's Eve. She's a party person. She's really very confident. And that really surprised me, reading those diaries and seeing that image of that person emerge. But, you know, everybody's interpretation of her is different. There are other things. She could be incredibly insecure. But for me, I'm kind of like, well, so could Sibelius. That doesn't make him an insecure person.
It's just so frustrating that the material is still unpublished. How do we get it to a point where we no longer have this issue? And it was the same with the sonatas. Clarke sonatas have only recently been published, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. But from the academic perspective, how can we get the material to that point?
I think you have to get publishers interested, because if publishers aren't going to accept the material, how is it going to get out there? So for me, I think publishers have a huge responsibility to actually take on this primary source material and publish it, because Rebecca Clarke's memoir, that is ripe for publication, and all a publisher needs to do is take it on. And similarly with the diaries, those could easily be published.
Right.
And I think that there are real sort of structural problems about the exclusion of women's voices, where things like, you know, we're sitting with all my books, and, you know, you can look along. We've got Sibelius's diary here, we've got Grieg's letters there in like edited volumes. That is what these women need.
Yes.
The material is sitting there, right? With Ethel Smyth, all her letters are in libraries or in collections. That material is there. It just needs a publisher to publish it. Gauntlet written down. Like that's what is needed.
I'd love to talk about Clarke's speech. The speech she was asked to give in the United States in 1945, that she titled The Woman Composer, Then and Now. So in it, picking up about halfway through, Clarke states, if women did compose anything, it probably never saw the light of day.
Yeah.
She goes on to discuss Smyth, describing her as a great character, born fighter, suffragette. Clarke then states that Smyth felt there was a prejudice against women's compositions. I think there was too, and she fought tooth and nail against it and made herself an awful nuisance. Actually, her music was done pretty often, but she was fighting for all the other women as well, and there's no doubt she made a big difference to my generation. Then she writes, the only trouble was that she went on fighting after there was nothing left to fight for. The fact is that by the time my generation came along, we weren't up against very much. In fact, I've sometimes thought there was a time when people were so anxious to be fair that our compositions were sometimes played when they wouldn't have been if we'd been men.
Yeah.
A lot of contradictions there.
Yes.
What do you think of all of this? What are your thoughts?
Oh, well, let's work through them one by one, shall we? Yes, so working backwards, this idea that women's compositions were performed when they might not have been it had they been men. I think this is really apparent to women composers who have been included in the odd all-woman concert. And it feels like their work might have been performed because they were women. And I think on those occasions, sadly, it was their gender that got them included in all-women concerts. Having said that, these all-women concerts are a real rarity, and the amount that their music, when their music is included in all-women concerts, we don't then see the flip side of where they were excluded in concerts that were majority or exclusively male. And so I think what she's actually identified there is unfortunate tokenism that she was on the receiving end of, rather than a kind of a wide acceptance of women's music. Then if we move back a claim, which is that there was little prejudice against her generation, I think this is actually pointing towards something really important, which is that progress isn't linear. And when Rebecca Clarke was actually coming of age as a composer, there were quite a surprising sometimes number of women performed in particular avenues. So Henry Wood, for example, did actually include quite a lot of women composers at the proms. And it takes until... In 1919, there were the same number of women composers performed at the proms as there were in 2019. It's just there's this whopping great big gap after World War II where women disappear completely, and it takes a long time for the number to slowly creep up again. So actually, I think she's pointing to something true there, which is that there was a sense of progress and that she could make it as a composer. She had her music performed in some really important venues like Wigmore Hall.
And she does credit Smyth. When it comes to
Smyth is really important. She had that very visible predecessor. So that was really important. Then on the flip side, there's also this sense that where she says, she kept fighting beyond when it was necessary. I think Clarke really felt very acutely that she wanted her music to be judged on its merits and wanted her gender nowhere near people's consideration of her. And so I think she writes this narrative that there was no gender prejudice whatsoever. Gender has nothing to do with music anymore. My generation, it's just about the music. Statistically, that is just not true.
That would be lovely.
That would have been great. But I think for her, it's really important to say that because she is so against sort of gender being a part of the way she's perceived. And she says, in other places, I'd rather be thought of as a 16th grade composer than be thought of differently because I'm a woman. And so I think that's really important to her. So I think that is a fascinating presentation because it really points to the number of sort of changing currents and different circumstances and contexts that often were very contradictory that women who happen to be composers were facing at the time. So I'd love it if a lot of things that Clarke says in that presentation were true and that women composers didn't have much to deal with then, but statistically that is very definitely not true. And as for her saying that, well, if women wrote compositions, they didn't make it anywhere, that I think points to the erasure of women in history. It's like, how would she know that women were writing operas in the 17th century and had them performed? She couldn't really, because that material was not available in the books that she would have had access to.
Absolutely.
So unfortunately, that's just a really powerful way of removing women from history.
Speaking of which, let's move on to her diary entry. Her entry in the 1927 Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians. This entry was quite extensive, listing all her major works. So it included her viola sonata, her piano trio, her cello rhapsody, and a substantial list of songs. Yet her full entry in the 1980 Grove Dictionary simply read C. James Briskin, referring to her husband. Heartbreaking, is it not?
Yes. And really angering because at some point, and this is one of the things that I really wanted to point out in the book, is that it's not that these women were never there, it's that they have been removed over time, deliberately so in this case, where an editor has decided she's not important enough to keep her entry. She can't. And
it's as simple as that.
It's as simple as that. Yeah, there's almost nothing more to say on that topic, right? Which is that a process of curation has systematically excluded women.
Let's talk about the current statistics published by an organisation called Dane Women in Music. The statistics within their 2024 report on equality and diversity in global repertoire. I found those rather alarming. This report examines the repertoire of 111 orchestras across 30 countries for the 2023-2024 season, building upon the annual research which began in 2018. The analysis was based on 16,327 compositions that were performed throughout the season, revealing that only 7.5% of the works programmed were composed by women. Of these, 5.8% were by white women. So men composed 92.5% of the programmed works, only 89.3 being written by white men. Shocking statistics that, from what I read, have actually gotten worse since the season before.
Yeah. And
there are many orchestras that programmed 0 works by women throughout the entire season. Academy of St. Martin in the Fields being one of them.
Yep.
Vienna Philharmonic, the Czech Philharmonic, and many, many others. Their programs representing no gender diversity and no racial diversity. So classical music still clearly has a diversity problem.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your view on this is. Where are we in terms of female representation and diversity in general within our field?
Yeah, I mean, so it's an interesting perspective for me, because my work is sort of between literature and music, and when I go and talk at literary festivals, it's like everybody here is sort of like, we know about feminism, you've got to be quite cutting edge to have anything interesting to say at all. And then you publish a book on women composers in classical music, and everyone's like, hold the phone, say, what, there are women? And it's bizarre. Classical music is really, I think, it has a lot of gender prejudice still to think about. And it's bizarre, frankly, the stuff that's written about women performers, for example, and the way they dress.
Oh gosh.
I mean, imagine saying that about pop performers, and people would go, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And there are reviews coming out about Yuja Wang saying, she's too sexy and all of this, and it's so frustrating to read that when you take it out of the context of classical music, and it becomes quite visible very quickly. And I think this is showing in these appalling statistics from Donna that actually, as you say, the 2024 season, in fact, included fewer works by women than in the previous season. And I think we saw this spike around Me Too, where people went, oh God, we've got to put some women on the programme, and that's died off.
Just a box-sticking exercise.
Exactly. And this is something that, I think as an industry, we've come a long way in the last 20, 30 years in terms of programming works by women. But I really want to safeguard against complacency, because I think there's something that I encounter a lot when I go and do talks and things, is this idea that actually this whole woman thing has gone too far, and there are too many women in concert halls now, and there are too many women on the programmes, and you can't move from women. Look at the statistics, and I think this is why this kind of research is so important, to actually be able to say, no. The statistics still show we are wildly far from gender equity. It is just that women have been absent for so long that any women at all feels like an awful lot of women. And as you say, there are some orchestras programming no women at all. So that statistic is with an awful lot of orchestras doing a huge amount of heavy lifting, where they're programming, maybe nearly sort of 50-50 gender with regard to gender, to cover orchestras who are programming no women at all. So I think to not be playing music by women now is a choice, and it's a choice that says a lot about one's priorities and values.
Absolutely. And it translates to other art forms. I looked at research. So a Center for the Study of Women in Television and Film in San Diego State University found that women comprised 16% of directors on their 250 top grossing films in 2023, down from 18% in 2022. So of the 116 directors attached to the 100 top grossing films of 2025, only 2025, I must have meant 2024, only 14 of those were women, and only 4 of those were women of colour.
Yeah.
So then it goes further, and then I read that according to the National Museum of Women in the Arts, 51% of visual artists today are women, but when it comes to exhibitions and gallery representations, the numbers tell a less optimistic story. In London, for example, 78% of galleries represent more men than women, while only 5% represent an equal number of male and female artists. So it really does translate. It's not... I often think that when you're comparing music genres, you think classical music is so behind, this is so tiring, it's so taxing, but then you look at film and you look at other art forms, and it's still very much present, sadly. Yeah.
Right, let's get to the point. Yeah, it is very depressing, and I think this is why, sadly, I wish I did not have to sit and talk about gender all the time, but until we're at a point where the statistics are more equal, and rights are more equal, then I think we do have to keep talking about it.
But it also drives you, does it not? I mean, with this album, this was the one that I was like, you know what? I can do more. How can I do more? How can I change things? And I'm sure through your books, that's exactly... If people think they're going to discourage you through the statistics, it sort of does the opposite, at least for me.
For sure. Yeah.
Jumping to a completely different topic briefly, The Mystery of Thomas Beecham. And
yes,
although I'm sure there are many. The comment he made in the 1944 Vogue's First Reader, which was published the same year that Smyth died. Although her name was not mentioned, he certainly wrote with Smyth in mind when he proclaimed that the increased visibility of women composers had brought music to a state of hopeless decadence, stating that there are no women composers, never have been, and possibly never will be. While he enjoyed being provocative, this certainly speaks to the significance of prejudice against women's creativity at the time. Yet, my issue, and this, I guess it all connects to what we were talking about earlier as a researcher, he championed Smyth's work. He performed it. Lots. How does this statement fit into the context of how he lived his life and performing her music?
I think he thought Smyth was exceptional. You know, he sort of isolated her as, oh, well, yes, Smyth wrote good music, but she was the only. She was the exceptional. She was the dame, this, that, and the other. But women generally can't write. And actually, you know, before he heard the records, he thought that, oh, you know, he dismissed Smyth as, oh, this battle axe who was a complete pain in the neck and a real problem. And it wasn't until he met Smyth and heard her playing her own score and was introduced by the harpsichordist Violet Gordon Woodhouse that he took her seriously at all. And I think that this is something that Smyth wrote about over and over again, how frustrating it was to have your manuscript's desk rejected by conductors who went, women can't write. And then when she turned up on their doorstep and was like, you will darn well listen to me, and then they go, oh, it's quite good actually. And that's precisely, I think, what Thomas Beecham did, which is that in his mind he rationalised Smyth as an exception that did not contradict what was otherwise in his head a rule about women. Sorry.
In my own research, I was often told, and would witness my colleagues being told, that in our writing we sound angry. That things are fine now, that there has been so much progress, that oppression of women is a thing of the past. Have you come across this in your own journey as a writer, especially in the early days when you were starting out and needed a lot of guidance?
I think there's a lot of space for anger in writing, actually. I like to hold some space for anger. both in research and in writing. I think it could be really productive. Like, I refer people to Audre Lorde's essay on anger. I think it's just a really important, why should one not be slightly angry about evident injustice? Full stop. and I think, yes, one needs to approach problems optimistically and with a sort of pragmatism. But I think there is also a space to say, actually, this is not acceptable. And it's not surprising if people are angry when they have cause to be.
This is really refreshing to hear. Well, the guidance, so much of the guidance I received was that if you're too angry, too emotional in writing, it won't be taken seriously. It's too much. It's so I think a lot of students or young writers will really appreciate that.
Well, especially because I think this is something that very often comes up in academia, and that comes from a very long tradition of sort of trying to separate intellectualism as something that you do in a sort of a very logical, rational, gendered, masculine way. And I think we have to account for emotion in intellectual processes. And if anger is one of those emotions, then I think we need to be honest about that and use it productively.
International Women's Day. It's coming up. Let's talk about it. While raising awareness of important issues is undoubtedly needed, choosing one day of the year to celebrate social, economic, political and cultural achievements of women, while in practice we are still marinating in gender inequality 365 days a year. How do you view this day?
So I've just written a post about exactly this, so we'll be going
I guess I'll read it.
So I have really mixed emotions about International Women's Day. I think it's a shame that it is still needed, and it very often feels like virtue signalling, where you will have institutions with a whopping great big gender pay gap and with sexual harassment cases, and clearly there are some big structural and systemic issues there, and then they'll go #feminism on International Women's Day on social media, and that's it, and then we sort of move on as you were. And that is incredibly frustrating. That said, this year, I think in particular, when looking at things that are happening in the US and sort of globally, I feel like actually it is becoming somehow a statement again to recognise International Women's Day and to hold space to support women and promote the work that they do and to give a platform for them. But in that context, I think, goodness, maybe unfortunately, we are still in a space where we need to have these promotional drives. International Women's Day is similar to the all-woman concert, right, where you just go, okay, let's advocate based on gender. And again, unfortunately, I'd love to not have to talk about gender, but here we are. And in that context, unfortunately, marking International Women's Day is starting to feel a bit important again. So I think for me, International Women's Day this year, I'm thinking about it as very much a kind of opportunity to think about, okay, how do we enact lasting change? This shouldn't be a tokenism exercise. It should be, for me, I think, a day to kind of reflect and go, okay, well, how do we move forward? How do we get to the point where International Women's Day is as remarkable as International Men's Day in November, right? Which is, who marks it? It should be a bit irrelevant. That's the dream.
What do you think needs to be done for these composers in order for them to reclaim their place in our concert halls?
A combination of things, some of which are practical, like publication. It's really hard to perform this music if it's not easily accessible. But I think it needs to be performed effectively, and it needs, to be on radio, it needs to be taught in schools. So it's a bit of a collaborative effort, I think, to effectively get to the point where their music is normal and their music is just as easy to play and just as recognisable as their sort of male counterparts of similar standing.
Absolutely. And I suppose my very last question would be, what are you working on next?
So I'm finishing up at the minute a book about women and music during World War II. And so I'm kind of looking at how women assert political agency, even in the most difficult circumstances, the ways in which musical women can be political, the way in which music can be political. And yeah, I'm just finishing that up at the minute. So that will
When
be
is that coming out?
Early 2027. So still a while away. So you have these long lead times in publication, but that's really exciting. So I'm going to be
all
putting
that
together.
fact checking, you know.
Genuinely, yes. that is what happens. Is we now have 2 years of like getting the manuscript to publication stage, and you know, I'm going to be hopefully working on curated concerts to sort of go around the book as well and get the music from the book out there, because one of the composers, well, the composer in this book is Akselrud Taylor. So we've got an album of her music coming out later this year. It will have the world premiere recording of her piano concerto, amongst other things, with Samantha Aguirre as the soloist. It's the BBC Philharmonic, John Andrews conducting. That is going to be a really exciting album, I hope.
Their statistics are quite good, BBC Philharmonic.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. There's a reason they're the orchestra, right? And so that is sort of the ongoing project for the next couple of years, is to work on getting that music out there. And then when the book comes out, people will be able to hear the music in the book.
Very exciting. Leah, on behalf of myself and everyone who may be watching this in the future, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's such a pleasure and such an honour.
Thank you.
Thank you.